Hey there, welcome. So not many people know this, but in my early 20s when I was in university, I actually experienced pretty severe social anxiety. It started off with mild to moderate self-consciousness, but eventually it manifested into what psychologists call the spotlight effect. This is where you feel everyone's attention is on you, but not in a narcissistic way, but more in a self-conscious way where you're walking down the street and you think everyone's going to notice your flaws, your insecurities, and so on. There were two things though that stabilized me. One was the deep-rooted belief that I will at some stage overcome this, and two, that the way to overcome it was through knowledge and information and research. Now, it's not to say that I or anyone else who's found themselves in a similar situation wouldn't benefit from seeing a professional, but I was very firm and adamant that at some point I would come across some piece of information that would help me overcome this particular issue. When eventually I stumbled upon a particular book which really took my understanding and progress to the next level. Up until this point things were progressing, but very slowly, and that progress would probably only be really noticeable in the long term. So this book that I'm referring to not only helped me understand what I was going through, but it really gave me the platform to explore my own mental health, and then eventually set me on my current journey of self-development and understanding of psychology. So what is this book that I'm referring to? Well, it's The Chimp Paradox by Professor Steve Peters. Professor Steve Peters is a consultant psychiatrist and an expert in the area of neuroscience, and he's worked with patients in the NHS as well as athletes at the top of their game in the Olympics. Over the course of his career when looking at the human brain, he eventually came to the conclusion and realization that the human brain is actually very similar to the chimp brain in how it operates and how it looks from a neuroscience perspective. His findings are what gave rise to the whole idea and mental model which is now known as the Chimp Paradox. So the central concept behind the Chimp Paradox is that your brain or your mind is not comprised of a single voice or identity, but instead it's made up of several competing forces. The author then gives a name to each one of these competing forces, and they are called the chimp, the human, and the computer. So interestingly, each one of these competing forces roughly maps to a particular part of the brain. So the chimp maps to the limbic system, the human maps to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the computer maps to the parietal lobe. So why is this significant? Well, most of us assume that we're a singular entity solely in charge of our own thoughts and decisions and influences in our life. But this is shown not to be the case, as there are several parts of the brain and the mind that are trying to do different things and have different types of agendas. So roughly speaking, the human is the calm, evolved, and rational part of the brain that has the ability to deal with complex decision making and often prioritizes future planning. The chimp is the less rational and more emotional part of the brain, which often prioritizes short-term pleasure over long-term reward. The computer then is essentially your belief system, and it stores memories and your long-term core values. What I find so brilliant about this book is that at first glance this particular analogy might seem basic or arbitrary, but over time as you delve more and more into the concepts, you realize how much solid foundations there really are. For example, the chimp aspect of our mind often resembles that of an actual chimp, both psychologically and in terms of the neuroscience. Equally, thinking of the third component as a computer makes a lot of sense, because what actually happens is that the human and the chimp both program that computer over time. The other thing that I like so much about the Chimp Paradox is how many practical applications it has in your day-to-day life. For example, have you ever had moments, say, when you've been stuck in traffic and you've had that wave of frustration or anger that's come over you that later, when thinking back on it, you really wondered where did that loss of control come from? So this is easily explained using the model of the Chimp Paradox, because what has actually happened is your chimp has hijacked your brain or mind and is kind of taking control, overpowering the human. And the reason why you feel that sense of frustration or panic or anxiety is because the chimp feels like it's actively being trapped in a cage. Now this might be taking the analogy one step too far, but in a way, if you think about it, what would you expect to happen if you took a chimp, put it in a metal box, that chimp expected to go in one particular direction, but instead was stuck and is stationary? So this chimp hijacking effect can be seen in lots of other examples, including public speaking, or if you felt that wave of nervousness or anxiety or panic when faced with, say, a job opportunity or interview, or even more profoundly if you're in an actual situation of real danger. So this leads me to the point that the chimp isn't actually the bad guy and serves many important purposes such as survival and protection. The chimp is motivated by several primal drives, such as the drive to eat, the drive to reproduce, the drive for security, and the drive for social acceptance. So this explains why public speaking for so many people is so scary, because the chimp interprets this particular scenario as one that is a threat to your social acceptance. Throughout our evolutionary history, social rejection led to social isolation, and this isolation almost certainly led to your own demise. So while it's true that this principle doesn't really hold true in the modern world, the chimp didn't evolve in the modern world, so really it knows no better, and it explains why it prioritizes social acceptance and often even social dominance over so many other things. Like I said, people often confuse the chimp with being some kind of bad guy or bad influence in your life and takes control of things and makes you act or feel a certain way when you don't want it. But again, the chimp is just a priority system, and it prioritizes keeping you alive in the short term. So an important lesson is that it's pretty futile to try and conquer or dominate the chimp, because just like in nature, the chimp is actually much stronger than the human and can often overpower it. So instead, the chimp is best thought of as a kind of pet to work alongside and eventually tame and train. So even though the chimp has the ability to dominate or overpower the human, with the right kind of training, over time, you can actually build up a very healthy relationship or dynamic between the chimp and the human. The other common misconception about the chimp is that people often use it as an excuse model when they exhibit bad or antisocial behavior. And while the chimp is capable of influencing you in that direction, you are the one who is solely responsible for your own chimp. So earlier in the video, I referenced the other entity that Professor Steve Peters describes, which is the computer. Now, the computer is very significant because it holds your core values and beliefs. But what I didn't mention earlier is that there's a particular order or pathway that goes through your mind that determines how you end up eventually acting. In a way, your human actually has the last say in terms of how you finally act, because your sensory inputs pass through the chimp first before eventually allowing you to make the decision as the human. So the speed of decision making and action is much faster in the chimp than it is the human. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you were in a field chased by a bull, you don't want to actually pause to consider your situation and what kinds of things that you need to think about. Instead, you want to be concerned with one thing and one thing only, which is your own safety and survival. So here the chimp forces itself into the driving seat and pushes the human aside because it doesn't actually care about rationality in moments of survival. But the other interesting layer to this is that the computer actually processes things even faster than the chimp. So while the chimp has the ability to dominate the human, the computer actually takes precedence over all of them. And again, this makes a lot of sense because certain beliefs apply differently to some individuals or even places. So for example, if you think of a spider or a snake, in some parts of the world, it makes sense to program the belief that this thing is hazardous and could kill you, whereas in other parts of the world, your brain might want to program the belief that spiders are actually harmless and therefore you don't need to panic. So over time, both the chimp and the human, through its own observations, program certain ideas or beliefs into the computer, and these are the things that actually influence how you behave or how you see the world when you actually come across certain events. So with the book, The Chimp Paradox, I'm obviously not going to summarize every page of the book, but think of it as an instruction manual for understanding how your mind operates and how to get the most out of that relationship between the chimp, the human, and the computer. As I implied at the start of the video, it's had a huge benefit and influence on my life. It's pushed me in a positive direction, but most importantly, when I was struggling with my own mental health, it gave me that perspective and information and knowledge that helped me overcome those issues. Personally, I believe that everyone could benefit from reading this book, but almost certainly there'll be individual pages or snippets or sections of the book that will resonate with you on an individual level. This is because probably it will relate back to an individual or specific moment of your life, or several, where you felt a certain way, or you were thinking, or you're in a certain pattern of behavior, and this book will explain exactly what happened and why you thought that way. The other thing to mention is that while the Chimp Paradox gives you a really good introduction to the chimp model and your own mind, if for whatever reason you want to take things further, because either you've already got a decent understanding of mental health or psychology, or you've already read the Chimp Paradox and you want to go in more detail and understand things in a deeper level, maybe in terms of the science or the psychology, then I would highly recommend the book A Path to the Jungle, which goes into things in even more detail, gives you more scientific references, and gives you a bit of a workbook so that you can understand things on a very specific level and in a sequential manner. So if you're not sold on this idea or the book as a whole, then feel free to check out some of the reviews on, say, Amazon or some of the book review sites such as Goodreads, and I'm sure you will come to the conclusion that this is a very beneficial and helpful book, as it's influenced people in the celebrity world or in the sporting world, and many normal or everyday people as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next one.